Please help me welcome Daniel Sheehan.
Thank you. Thank you. In the short time that we have here before we get to the panel, I want to just sort of refocus the fact that the theme for today of the architects of the new paradigm is finding your sanity in an insane world. And in light of Lori's sort of keynote beginning of this, the question that she posed is that in this crazy world of conflicting news coverage and finger pointing, how are people supposed to really figure out what the truth is? And that's been sort of a subset of all of the talks this morning. And then she asked the question very pointedly, is there a certain personality type that she talks about in sociopaths, et cetera, who are intent on creating chaos and sowing confusion and attempting to lie to you and then attack you, trying to get you to think that maybe you're crazy or that you and all the people that share your view of reality different than theirs are crazy. And we want to emphasize that the architects for the new paradigm have, for the entire 5 years of our history together, been nonpartisan. We go out of our way to be nonpartisan. But when you start talking about this concept of someone lying to you constantly and then attacking you if you disagree with them, and bullying you and threatening you and telling everybody that you're crazy or you're corrupt or you're sick, that we actually all know who we're talking about. And that the particular phenomenon that we're talking about was specifically referenced as this person gaslighting America. That you hear that phrase, I heard that phrase a lot of times, and they make reference to, it was a movie about gaslighting, and it really was a play that started in 1938, and then there was a 1944 movie starring Ingrid Bergman. And what it specifically refers to is the fact that in that play and in that movie, there was an abusive husband, a bullying husband, who was in fact constantly trying to make his wife think she was crazy. And he would turn down the gas lights. It was in the 1890s, they had gas lit home, and he would turn the gas lights down. And when she started complaining about it, he would attack her as though she was crazy. And that he was attempting to make her crazy, and that this term has actually become a term of art now, of gaslighting, and it's when a person, usually in a position of authority, as Mark was talking about, up here in front of you, or on the news, or in the presidential office, or a senator, or someone in a position of authority, willfully, intentionally lies to you about a very material past or present fact. It doesn't cover people who just disagree with you or who make an error. It's people who consciously and knowingly lie to you. And then they actually attack you if you disagree with them. And that they actually go so far as to try to manufacture events to make you think that you're crazy. They actually go around doing false things, trying to distract you, generate some shiny object, as they refer to distract you from this, and then attack you and tell you that you're sick. Now, in addition to today being the anniversary of Sandy Hook, I think it bears mentioning that we're here the day after the President of the United States has been impeached, is in the process of being impeached by the Congress of the United States. And that one of the very specific things that they're impeaching him for is the assertion that he is lying, consciously lying, and attacking people who don't agree with him, and bullying him, and bullying everyone else. And so we find ourselves at this particular time in this very peculiar situation. It's been made passing reference to in the past, where we actually get two completely contradictory views of reality. If people watch Fox News, they get one whole kind of reality. If they watch MSNBC News, they get another whole reality. As it turns out, over the last 3 years, the group that is disagreeing with Fox News has evolved from MSNBC to include CNN, to include the New York Times, to include virtually every other outlet that has an intellectual IQ above room temperature. And so that you've got this situation now where we're being bombarded by Fox News, and people are now starting to question whether or not this is okay, whether this is what we're faced with, of having to confront this. Now, I come from law schools and doing litigation where you're actually in court, and you see this like all the time. You have the prosecution put on this case saying that this person who's the defendant is the worst person in the whole world. You know, they basically eat babies. They've got a whole long history of being terrible, awful people. And then you have the defense coming on, sometimes arguing that, oh, this is the most saintly person in the whole world. This is the wonderful person. You all ought to praise them, et cetera. My own particular practice over the past 50 years has been to come into the courtroom and try to get the jury to understand what's true. Now, this is a different thing than most defense attorneys do. But on the other hand, I only represent people who are innocent, which is different than, you know, F. Lee Bailey, who represents professional criminals, or, you know, other people who represent the people who pay them the very most, or represent corporations. And so it's been easier for me. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's extraordinarily important for us to recognize that there is such a thing as reality. Now, I know that there's a lot of talk about, and I understand it perfectly well, the issue of quantum physics and the ability to draw up out of the plenum one of the possibilities for the next microsecond, and that it has to do with collective intentionality on the part of our human family. And there's an entire discipline that's known as postmodernism that attacks the historical accepted standards of reality, and points out that these standards of reality have been created oftentimes by interest groups, such as white male wealthy people, who actually fabricate an entire set of standards of reality and then diminish women. They diminish people of non-Caucasian people. They diminish people who are not professionals, et cetera. But the fact of the matter is, you can't get too carried away with all of that. You know, that postmodernism has now attempted to attack virtually every single dimension of reality. And there's actually a group in France that's called the Collège de Pataphysique, and they have this whole discipline they call pataphysics, which is basically every single year they have people send in propositions of truth, and then they spend the entire year figuring out how to disassemble them. And then they give an award to those who are more effective in disassembling a completely clear truth. Now, this is a problem in our culture, because the people right now are put into it is absolutely true that unlike any period of time that we've seen, basically since the end of World War II, 1945, all the way up till the present, you know, that this is probably the most peculiar time period that we've seen, where people are actually confused now about what's true, and that they're actually confused about whether there is such a thing as truth, and that they've somehow been drawn into by Fox News and by President Trump and by people like Jim Johnson and the other people in the Republican Party. Let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. You know, the fact of the matter is that the problem that we're confronted with right now is a lot of people think it's caused by Donald Trump, and that they're very concerned about attributing all of this to Donald Trump, and that people won't come to a meeting like this if you think it's going to be trashing Donald Trump. The fact of the matter is that Donald Trump is not the one that is solely responsible for this particular phenomenon that's going on here in the country. Because we will remember, a lot of people think that this sort of may have started right after 9/11. Because after 9/11, we got W. Bush and we got Karl Rove, and we got this whole propaganda machine that was saying that, well, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and oh, it turns out that we've invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields and we've occupied them, we've killed tens of thousands of people, and it turns out it wasn't true. And you notice how they just mention that periodically. Oh, by the way, it isn't true, but we have launched a major invasion, we've occupied the oil fields, millions of people are being disrupted and driven into being migrants. But the fact is that that was a flat lie. It wasn't accidental, it was a total fabrication. And the fact is that so it wasn't Donald Trump that started this. The fact is that you may remember there was a famous incident that took place shortly after 9/11 in 2002 when Karl Rove confronted Ron Suskind, who was a major author, and Suskind had criticized the press secretary for W. Bush, and Karl Rove pulled him aside and started chastising him. And Karl Rove actually said to him, he said, you know, the problem with you guys is that you're still dealing in a fact-based reality, and it's actually a rather extraordinary thing. There's a full quote here. I'll find it for you. Exactly what he said is the following. The problem with you guys is that you're still operating in a fact-based reality. People who believe the solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible aspects of reality. But that's not the way the world actually works anymore. We are now an empire, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality judiciously, as you will, we will act again, creating a new reality, which you can then study too. And that's how things will sort themselves out. For we are now history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left just to study what it is we are doing. So it's really important for us to understand that this phenomenon that we're actually talking about here today, in its kind of nuances, et cetera, is a function of a very real set of historical facts that have taken place here. And that is, and it wasn't 9/11. It didn't start with 9/11. When it started was on June 6th of January 6th of 1992. And I want to tell you about this so you'll understand that there's no reason for us to be confused. There's no reason for us to take the bait to get into talking about fake news. Fake news is a big concept that was developed by these people to characterize everybody who doesn't agree with their fat lies, period. I mean, let's be clear. Let's not be self-conscious about what's happening here. What happened is that this all began with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. That all of us basically have spent all of our lives actually during the Cold War. And the Cold War didn't start in 1945 at the end of World War II, like people talk about. It started in 1917 when the people overthrew the Tsar in Russia during World War I in 1917 and withdrew from World War I and established an international socialist regime and took on what amounted to the robber barons. There was an entire robber baron era that took place here in the United States at the end of the American Civil War from 1868 to 1898, a short 30-year period that actually during that time, there's some 25 major families in the country began to monopolize and control all the resources of the country. They monopolized the oil, the Standard Oil. They monopolized the steel industry, Carnegie. They monopolized the agricultural areas. And they did this through the creation of a new business device called the shareholder-owned corporation. It was a brand new device, this corporation idea. The corporations previously to that time existed for a very narrow reason. There was a corporation set up the Plymouth Bay Colony that was set up by the king and queen. There were a corporation that was set up to build a turnpike, for example. But this whole new device that was developed in 1873 after the end of the Civil War was an entire device by means of which people who owned a business operation could in fact own all of the assets in a shared manner and as a share of stock, but they were totally immunized against any liability for whatever it is the company did. And so what the company was driven by was the sole objective of trying to maximize the profit that that company could make. And so what they would do is they would engage in lying and dissembling. They would make the product as inexpensively as they could to drive the cost down. They tried to maximize the amount of money they would get for it. They would try to destroy their competitors because it seemed perfectly logical. If you're trying to maximize your profits, that's what you do. And what this did is it generated an entire era, which you can study about actually, even in junior high schools, in colleges. This was the robber baron era. And it generated the consequent event of the age of imperialism, with the United States, laying claim to Hawaii and Guam and the Pacific Islands, and starting the Spanish-American War, and sending troops into Latin America a dozen times to overthrow governments to gain control over their resources for particular companies like United Fruit, for example, in Nicaragua. Okay? And there was a particular law firm by the name of Sullivan and Cromwell that represented a lot of these major corporations. And there was a private investment group called Brown Brothers Harriman. And Brown Brothers Harriman was a particular private investment group. The heads of these 24 families belonged to this private investment group. In the private investment group, the CEO of the private investment group was a guy by the name of George Herbert Walker, which may sound familiar to you because he's in fact the grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush. Okay? And this particular private investment firm was actually engaged with Sullivan and Cromwell, who was their legal counsel. And their legal counsel assigned to Brown Brothers Harriman was a fellow by the name of Dulles. Okay? And that Allen Dulles went on to become the head of the Central Intelligence Agency for the United States. And what we're dealing with here, this is not something that we should be confused about, something that it's a troublesome thing about what's truth and what's not truth. We are being subjected to now a very real event, because what happened is that entire robber baron era that rose into power and domination in the country by 1898 in the administration of McKinley, they basically gained control of the entire United States government. They bribed the senators and Congress people. They paid massive amounts for their campaign contributions, et cetera. They took over the entire government, and they drove the country into a depression, which we all know about. By 1929, they had engaged in gathering and controlling all the monopoly, control over all the resources. And because of their pursuit of short-term profits, they ended up driving the country in the world into depression. And so what happened is at that point in time, a movement was begun. At that time it was called the Chautauqua movement. It was a movement that was generated by the United Methodist Church, actually, and the National Board of Homeland Ministries of the Methodist Church set up a thing called the Chautauqua movement, where they began to try to explain that the activities of these major monopolistic corporations and the shareholders and the management of the corporations were in fact acting in a way that was totally contrary to all of the Judeo-Christian social ethical values that we're all raised to believe in. And they fostered and promoted child labor, kids 7 years old, 8 years old, working 18-hour days in the coal mines. They had these sweatshops for women where they were getting paid, 20 cents a day, and they weren't allowed to go to the bathroom more than once a day. These things are known. I'm not telling you anything that you haven't heard about in the past. What I'm trying to do is assemble a set of known pieces of information, not fake news, all part of real, genuine history that is clearly established. And that what happened is because of that kind of conduct, the Chautauqua movement generated at that time a whole set of meetings all around the country. And it generated the American labor movement. It generated the women's suffrage movement that resulted in 1919 with women finally getting the right to vote. It generated the original environmental movement with setting up national parks, et cetera. It generated the universal free education, grade school education for children. It established all of these movements that basically the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal set up and put into law, finally. Okay, and what's happened is that there was a period from the 1917 period when the Russian Revolution took place. It rose up and tried to characterize what was going on in Western culture of this major set of imperialist activities on behalf of the United States, sending military expeditionary forces into South America, et cetera, that this was a terrible thing. And what happened is that confrontation went on from 1917 all the way up to December 31st of 1991, when President Gorbachev in Russia voluntarily dissolved the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union stepped out of this 75-year-long dialectical confrontation with the major corporations in Western civilization. And what's happened here is immediately, and this is what I want to talk to you about, immediately after the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 31st of 1991, a meeting was held in Washington, D.C., in the White House, in the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, and his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney. They held a meeting in the West Wing of the White House, and Dick Cheney's staff was all there. Paul Wolfowitz, David Addington, Doug Feith, Elliott Abrams, Scooter Libby. There were a half a dozen of them there, and they drafted, and this is extraordinarily important for you to remember, because this is not fake news. They drafted the 1992, this is January 6th of 1992, the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And what it said was that, look, for the past 50, 60 years, we have been using the fact that the Soviet Union existed as the rationale for our demanding $500 to $600 billion a year for a major military budget. Now the Soviet Union has dissolved, and there's going to be a great deal of pressure on us to reduce the military budget and then come forward with lots of the promises of democracy and providing civil rights and human rights for people around the world. So we have to resist that. We have to recognize that we are now the sole remaining superpower on the entire planet. And what we need to do is we need to increase the military budget. And we have to be able to establish full spectrum dominance over the planet. And this is a document, this is a classified document, which I've got a copy of, I can show it to anybody who needs it, that it's the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And it says that the purpose of this alliance, this new policy of our Defense Department, is to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials on the planet for our corporations. All right? And especially they were talking about oil, specifically. And what happened is that document got leaked to the Washington Post. And the Washington Post then published this rather scathing editorial against it, saying this was a return to the robber baron era, a return to American imperialism, a return to gunboat diplomacy. That's what they said. And so what happened is George Herbert Walker Bush, the president at that time, issued a statement saying, look, we're not acknowledging that there is such a document. But even if there is, it may only be a draft. And so he sat down and did a second draft. He personally, George Herbert Walker Bush, and a man by the name of Theodore G. Shackley. Theodore G. Shackley was the ADDO, the Associate Deputy Director for Operations, worldwide covert operations for the American Central Intelligence Agency. And they drafted up the second iteration of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. And what this said is, like, we oughtn't to do this unilaterally on the part of the United States. We shouldn't try to establish full spectrum dominance just on the part of the United States. We should do this in an alliance. And we should have an alliance between the United States, Canada, Mexico, not the Mexican indigenous people, but the major political party in Mexico made up of the Castilian Spanish, and the UK, and France, and Italy, and Spain, and the new reunified Germany. And we should invite Russia to become part of this new alliance, now that they have spun off all of their ethnic provinces. And it said that the purpose of this new Northern Industrial Alliance, as they're going to call it, is to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by the members of the new Industrial Alliance. That's what's going on here. That's what's changed, what's happened. And what happened is, you may remember, immediately, shortly prior to the end of the Cold War, on December 31st of 1991, as soon as George Herbert Walker Bush is still in the presidency, got wind of the fact that the Soviet Union might be dissolving by the end of the year, what he did is he sent a personal handwritten communique to Saddam Hussein in Iraq through April Gillespie, who was our United States ambassador to Iraq. And in that short memo, he said, look, I know that you're having trouble with Kuwait on your southern border, and you believe that they're slant drilling under your border and stealing Iraqi oil. I would like to have you resolve that peacefully if you can. But if you find it necessary to resort to the use of military force, I want you to know that I personally would not view that as contrary to the long-term best interests of the United States. Okay. Not surprisingly, Saddam Hussein immediately began to assemble military troops along their southern border with Kuwait. And Dick Cheney, who was his Secretary of Defense, contacted Prince Bandar, who was the ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia. And he said, look, I want you to come to the West Wing. I got to show you something. He said, we have now got evidence indicating that Saddam Hussein is getting ready to invade and occupy Kuwait. And we have equally strong intelligence data suggesting that once he occupies Kuwait, he's going to be going into Saudi Arabia and attempting to overthrow the House of Saud. Okay? Total lie, absolute total lie, no evidence whatsoever for it. But what he did is he showed him real-time NSA video satellite of all the military troops assembling along the southern border of Iraq to go into Kuwait. And so he said that if in fact it's borne out that he's going to go into Kuwait, then you can believe our story that he's going to go into Saudi Arabia. And I want you to set up a meeting for me, that's Dick Cheney, to go to Saudi Arabia and meet with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. They invade, he gets to go to the meeting, he goes to the meeting with King Faoud and Crown Prince Abdullah, and he says, look, what I want to do is I want to invoke an old secret 1972 treaty that was set up by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger on their way back from China. When they were in China with that secret opening to China, they were on their way back and they stopped in Saudi Arabia and met at that time with King Faisal. And they made an agreement that they were going to renew the 60-year exclusive lease agreement that exists on behalf of the 7 major Western oil corporations. They call them Aramco, the Arab American corporations. Standard Oil, the BP, Exxon Mobil, etc. And they renewed the 60-year contract then, and they agreed to increase the money that was going to be going to the House of Saud. It was going to be going to the House of Saud privately, not to their country, but to the royal family, that they were going to be getting a percentage of the income from the sale of the oil. And what they did is they agreed to raise that from 42 cents a gallon at the pump to $1.42. But they had to agree to use that extra $1 a gallon at the pump that they were going to be getting to buy weapons from the United States exclusively from our military contractors. The AWACS airborne radar, the over-the-horizon radar, the F-16s, they had to buy them all from the United States Secondly, they had to use another portion of that $1 extra at the pump to dredge out the harbors in Saudi Arabia to be able to take American warships. And then they had to use a third part of it to actually build major military bases at which United States military could be staged. And the fourth thing they had to agree to is that if either Russia or China made any effort to move against the oil fields and occupy the oil fields, that Saudi Arabia would invite the United States to come in. So we could bring our warships into the newly dredged out harbors, put our military troops in those bases, and protect you against China or Russia. And what we want to do, he said, is it's not Russia or China that's doing this, but it's Iraq, and it's Saddam Hussein. So what we want to do is come in, you invite us in, and we'll drive Saddam Hussein back up out of Kuwait and stop him from coming into Saudi Arabia. And that's what he wanted them to do. Well, it turns out that the chief of security for the House of Saud, Turki bin Faisal, knew of this meeting going on, and he came in and said to King Faud and Crown Prince Abdullah, don't do this. Do not invite the infidels into the Holy Land, because if they come in, they won't leave. And what happened is he said, look, I've got an alternative for you, and I want to have a meeting at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to present the alternative. So the next morning, Turki bin Faisal, the chief of security of the House of Saud and of Saudi Arabia, comes in to meet with King Faud and Crown Prince Abdullah, and he brings with him two guys, Khalil Mahfouz, who's the head of the Royal Saudi Family Bank, and Mohammed Baroum, who's the heir to the wealthiest family in all of Saudi Arabia. They own all the steel mills and the concrete and all. They come in and they say, we have an alternative. Do not invite the infidels into the Holy Land. We have an alternative. They go and open the door, and in walks Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden, the best boyhood friend of Turki bin Faisal, the chief of security of the House of Saud, since they were 4 years old. And he comes in and says, look, I've got 10,000 battle-hardened Mujahideen troops that have just gotten through kicking the crap out of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan for having them come into Afghanistan. We can mobilize those, they're up in the Khyber Pass. I can bring them down, and we can drive Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq. Don't invite the infidels in. And it was an hour-long presentation with charts and everything of how they were going to do this. And then they left. Dick Cheney was still there at the palace and found out about this, goes back in and asks for a second meeting. He goes back in and he meets with King Faud and Crown Prince Abdullah, and he says, look, I've got a sweetener for this. Here's what we're going to do. In addition to my agreeing to come in, bring the United States in and protect you against Saddam Hussein, we will protect you against your own people because they hate you. You know, your princes, you know, whoring all around Europe, losing $1 million at a throw of a dice, all their big Eldorado Cadillacs and everything. And these fundamentalist Islamicists hate you. So we will, if you invite us in, we'll protect you against your own people. We will protect the House of Saud, who now kills journalists and chops them up in their embassy, and nothing happens to them. You know, the House of Saud that makes massive war against the people in the area and does nothing about it because they want the oil. Okay, so that's what happened. And so the King Faud and Crown Prince Abdullah said, that's a deal. And they invited the US in. The Bush administration, with Dick Cheney as their Secretary of Defense, then gathered up what they call the Alliance of the Willing, which included, I think, New Zealand and Fiji, and that they went in and invaded the Middle Eastern oil fields. And they invaded them, occupied the Middle Eastern oil fields, drove Saddam Hussein back up into Iraq, and then left him in power. And said, what we're going to do is leave him in power, but we have to establish a no-fly zone here, all along the border of Iraq, which requires 250,000 full-time United States military occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields. And that's when Osama bin Laden said, I told you so. That's exactly what they were going to do, because they want to occupy the Middle Eastern oil field because they know the Soviet Union is getting set to dissolve, and they want to keep the oil fields away from China. You got to understand the strategic play that's going on here. You know, I mean, don't fall prey to this, you know, short-term, fake news here. Trump is a liar. Yes, right. news. That's big news. The reality is that this is a major strategic play that's going on. And that there is what's really destabilizing the people in the country is that they've returned right back to the robber baron era. As soon as the Soviet Union came out of the field from the 75-year Cold War, where there was a standoff between the two of them, the kind of state capitalist, Caucasian-driven imperialist ventures of the Western military, and the Soviet Union, which later turned under Stalin into an equal competing force. As soon as they dropped out of the field, the National Republican Party, and it's absolutely clear that we understand this, the Republican Party regressed right straight back to the same ethos that governed the robber baron era, because this is exactly the ethos that they're governed by. And what the Democratic Party did is, rather than taking them on and holding fast to Franklin Roosevelt's liberal democratic principles, what they did is they said, why should we stay there? Let's move to the right with them. So the Republican Party moved just a little bit to the right of center as a conservative over to the hardcore reactionary position. And the Democratic Party moved over under the thing called the Democratic Leadership Conference, Richard Gebhardt and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Al Gore and the others. And what they did is they migrated over to the right of center. And so what we have going on right now is a debate now between a right of center Democratic Party, now wishing to be represented by Joe Biden. No mistake about it. The DNC wants Joe Biden to be their candidate to get things back to normal. Get things back to normal, just to the right of center. Okay? And they're trying to pretend that it's just Donald Trump. And if we can only get rid of Donald Trump by either impeaching him or beating him in the 2020 election, or even if we only have to have him term limit out, once we get rid of him, things will be okay. Things are not going to be okay by getting rid of Donald Trump. Because we're dealing with what is really destabilizing the American people in our sense of reality is the fact that we're being dragged back into trying to have to endorse and accept a reactionary worldview as our governing principles of our government. Not the liberal worldview of Franklin Roosevelt, not even the moderate worldview of I guess Eisenhower and Bill Clinton in the Democratic Leadership Conference, but in fact we're trying to be force-fed a reactionary worldview, and the fact is that the reactionaries on the spectrum of political worldviews make alliance with authoritarians. That's what Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is an unabashed authoritarian. He's got every single one of the characteristics, and one can try to deal with certain mental, psychological qualities of him or other sociopaths and talk about him being clinically ill. The fact of the matter is he's the epitome of what it is that the Republican Party stands for right now. And that is this arrogant, swaggering, self-interested, selfish, make America great again, trying to now, in the face of global climate change, with 193 nations meeting in Paris to insist that we cut back on the burning of fossil fuels, he ends up declaring that to be a total hoax. Just says it. It's a total hoax. No matter what 2,500 world scientists in the International Panel on Climate Change of the UN have all given the details of all of what's happening now, he simply declares it to be a hoax, a plot by China to try to underline our industrial base. Okay? And they keep on just promulgating that. And what he does now is he insists that the United States, because of our potential energy crisis and not having to depend upon foreign oil, needs to develop all of our own oil. And so the second thing that he does in office, after declaring that Muslims are not going to be allowed to come to our country, the second thing he does is unilaterally orders the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, to build it all the way from Canada, all the way down through the entire central United States, down to the Gulf Coast, where it's going to be refined and sold to other countries. Not one drop of it being used to provide energy for the country, all in the name of a domestic energy emergency. And now he's turned around completely and said, look, what we're going to do is we're going to authorize drilling in all the national parks now, on Indian reservations and all along all of our coastlines, so that America, the United States, will be the #1 exporter of energy and fuels in the whole world. And when he says the United States is going to be #1, he's talking about the oil corporations, not our country, the oil corporations. And so he selects as his Secretary of State the CEO of ExxonMobil. You know, and ExxonMobil has just made a contract with Russia to drill for their oil in the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea and under the Arctic shelf. 87 billion barrels of oil under the Arctic shelf. 1/3 of all the natural gas on the planet is there. And so that's what Trump is trying to do. Trump is kind of a doofus and thinks, well, look, that's what the point is, so let's make a deal with Russia. Only he's kind of a reductionist and he doesn't have much subtlety. So he just decided to go ahead and do that in any way he could. And perhaps to get a little taste of the profits themselves, of potentially being one of the secret partners in an effort to buy 20% of Rosneft, which is the nationally owned oil corporation of Russia. They put 20% of the company on the market, and all of a sudden this mysterious group called the Interagency Group shows up, being one of the purchasers, and it's got a little office down in the Grand Caymans, and the only other operation in that little building is BlackRock, the CEO of which is an economic advisor for Donald Trump. Look, I mean, you've got to understand what's happening here. It's a lot more profound and a lot deeper. So it's not just a question of fake news. It's not just a question of can we tell the truth or not. The truth is clear. And what's destabilizing all of us is the effort to drag us back into supporting a reactionary, self-interested, selfish country, you know, on behalf of Caucasian superiority in the world and defying global climate change. We've got to come to grips with this, and we've got to deal with this. You can't not talk about Donald Trump whenever you're talking about a problem, but you can't blame it all on Donald Trump. You can't be misled into believing that getting rid of Donald Trump is going to solve this type of disquiet that we have in our country. We have to re-embrace a progressive worldview rooted in spiritual values, come to study the Chautauqua movement that generated all of these new movements in our country, and get behind this. Register everybody that you can get your hands on to vote, and get them out to vote. And get the progressive worldview reestablished as the ethos of the United States, to help people around the world, not to exploit them, and to save ourselves from global climate change, not make ourselves the #1 exporter of oil and fossil fuels in the world. That's what I asked to come to talk to you about. Okay? So there it is.